At 9:30 on a wet Thursday evening, Dr. Arthur Bell was telephoned by a dead man. He did not know this at first. There was, naturally, no reason why he should. Dead men were not generally distinguishable by telephone, and the human voice, unlike the face, had no accepted expression for death. A man could sound perfectly alive while being several hours beyond the assistance of medicine. Dr. Bell was sitting beside the drawing-room fire at the time, reading an article on the declining standards of rural dentistry. He had reached the conclusion that dentistry had probably deserved better when the telephone rang. The telephone stood on a small table in the hall, where it had always seemed slightly out of place. Bell disliked it there. He disliked telephones generally, but his wife maintained that having one was essential to village life, which was an argument Dr. Bell had never understood. Most village life, in his experience, consisted of discovering what other people were doing without having to telephone them. He rose, crossed the hall, and lifted the receiver. "Dr. Bell speaking." There was a pause. Then a man said, quite calmly, "Arthur?" Bell stopped. The voice was low, slightly breathless, and familiar. He knew it immediately. "Who is this?" The man on the other end did not answer. Instead, Bell heard the faint sound of movement, followed by a short click. The line went dead. For several seconds, he remained holding the receiver against his ear. Then he replaced it. His wife looked up from her knitting. "Who was that?" "I'm not sure. Someone wanting you to go out?" "No." "Was it a patient?" "No." Mrs. Bell waited. She had been married to Arthur Bell for 31 years, and had learned that silence from him was rarely accidental. He was a quiet man, but not an absent-minded one. When he said he was not sure, it generally meant that he was quite sure, and disliked the consequences. "Arthur?" "Yes?" "You look peculiar." "I don't." "You do." He glanced at the hall mirror. He looked exactly as he had looked 5 minutes earlier. Grey hair, spectacles, cardigan, and the expression of a man who had been interrupted while reading something he had not particularly wanted to read. "It was Mr. Hargreaves," he said. His wife lowered the knitting. "No." Bell looked at her. "I beg your pardon?" "You said Mr. Hargreaves." "Yes." "Mr. Julian Hargreaves?" "Yes. But he's dead. I am aware of that." The room became very quiet. Rain ticked against the windows. Somewhere outside, a car passed slowly along the lane and disappeared towards the square. Mrs. Bell put down her knitting. "When did he die?" "Yesterday afternoon." "Then why did you say it was him?" "Because it was his voice." She considered this. "Could someone have been imitating him?" "Possibly." "Was it a good imitation?" Bell did not answer immediately. "No," he said at last. "It wasn't an imitation. There were people in Wetherby who could imitate Julian Hargreaves rather well." Hargreaves had been chairman of the parish council for 11 years and possessed the unfortunate combination of a distinctive voice and a large number of opinions. He spoke through his nose, clipped the ends from his sentences, and had a habit of drawing breath sharply before disagreeing with anyone. The voice Bell had heard had done all three. There was another detail, too. The man had called him Arthur. Almost everyone in the village called him Dr. Bell. Hargreaves had always called him Arthur. Mrs. Bell picked up her knitting again, though she did not resume knitting. Perhaps someone is being unpleasant. Perhaps. People do that when there is a death. Not usually by telephone. No, usually they leave flowers. Bell smiled faintly. The telephone rang again. Both of them looked at it. It rang a second time. Bell crossed the hall but did not pick up the receiver immediately. On the third ring he answered. "Dr. Bell." Nothing. Then, very softly, came a woman's voice. "Doctor?" "Yes." "You heard him, didn't you?" Bell straightened. "Who is this?" The woman breathed in sharply. "You heard Julian." The line clicked. Bell remained still. Then he heard the dial tone. Behind him, his wife had risen. "Who was that?" "I don't know." "What did she want?" Bell looked at the telephone. "I think she wanted to know whether I had heard a dead man speaking." Mrs. Bell stared at him. "That seems an unnecessarily complicated way of spending an evening." "It does." Outside, the rain continued to fall over Wetherby. And in the quiet little village, where everybody knew who had died, who had visited him, and who had been expected at his house that afternoon, Dr. Bell began to wonder why somebody had needed to ask whether he recognized the voice. He was not yet wondering who had made the call. That, as he would later admit, was the first mistake. The next morning, Dr. Bell received the announcement before breakfast. Mrs. Bell was buttering toast when someone knocked twice at the front door. It was Mrs. Pritchard, the postmistress, wearing a raincoat buttoned to the throat and carrying no post. "I thought you ought to know," she said. "That is rarely a promising beginning," said Mrs. Bell. Mrs. Pritchard looked past her into the hall. "Has Dr. Bell heard? He is having coffee. About Mr. Hargreaves." Dr. Bell appeared behind his wife. "What about him?" Mrs. Pritchard lowered her voice, although there was nobody nearby. "They have found him." Bell did not move. "Found him where?" "At his house. I thought he was already found." "He was found yesterday." "Yes." Mrs. Pritchard hesitated. "This is different." The expression on her face made Mrs. Bell put down the knife. "What do you mean? The police have been there since 7. Bell glanced at the clock. "Who called them?" "That is the trouble." "What trouble?" "Nobody seems to know." There was a small silence. Mrs. Pritchard then added, "Inspector Price is there now." That name altered the atmosphere. Inspector Price was not a dramatic man. He had no reputation for sudden accusations, theatrical entrances, or the sort of investigative habits which made village people feel that crime was more interesting than gardening. He was, instead, patient, courteous, and irritatingly difficult to hurry. He had come to Wetherby twice before. On the first occasion, he had investigated the disappearance of a silver christening spoon. On the second, he had investigated the disappearance of the person who had taken it. Both matters had been settled without anyone being arrested. Mrs. Pritchard looked at Bell. "They say Mr. Hargreaves was not alone." Bell felt the first real chill of the morning. "Yesterday?" "No, last night. But he died yesterday afternoon." That is what everyone thought. Everyone, apparently. Mrs. Pritchard looked uncomfortable. "I only heard it from Mr. Cole at the bakery. He said the police think someone was in the house after the doctor certified the death." Bell said nothing. Mrs. Pritchard watched him carefully. "Doctor?" "Yes." "Did you certify him?" "I did." "And he was dead?" Bell gave her a tired look. "Quite dead." "I only asked." "You asked the question as though you hoped I had made a clerical error." Mrs. Pritchard smiled nervously. "That was not my intention. Most village questions are innocent until examined closely." Mrs. Bell glanced at him. "You are becoming philosophical." "I am becoming suspicious." That ended the conversation. Mrs. Pritchard departed 3 minutes later, taking with her the satisfaction of having delivered information while preserving the appearance of reluctance. Bell stood at the window. Across the road, Mr. Cole was already outside his bakery, speaking to 2 customers who had no visible reason to remain there. The news had travelled. It always did. By 10 o'clock, Wetherby knew that Julian Hargreaves had been found dead twice, that the doctor had spoken to him after death, that a woman had telephoned the surgery during the night, and that Inspector Price had forbidden anybody to enter the Hargreaves house. Only one of those statements was true. Bell was certain of that. At 10:15, the telephone rang. This time he answered at once. "Dr. Bell, Inspector Price." Bell recognized the calm voice. "Good morning. I'm afraid I have an unpleasant request. Those are becoming rather common. I need you to come to Hargreaves's house." Bell looked towards his wife. "Why?" "I would rather explain when you arrive." "Is this concerning his death?" "Partly." Bell waited. Price continued. "More particularly, it concerns something found beside the telephone." Bell's fingers tightened around the receiver. "What was found?" "I think you already know." "I do not." "You heard his voice last night. It was not a question." Bell stared at the telephone. "Who told you?" "No one." "Then how do you know?" There was a pause. "Because the person who called you made the same mistake with me." Bell felt a strange pressure behind his eyes. "What mistake?" Price's voice remained perfectly even. "She assumed that because you were a doctor, you would be the first person to recognize that the voice was impossible. Bell said nothing. Price added quietly, and she was wrong. The line went silent. Bell replaced the receiver. His wife was watching him. Inspector Price? Yes. What does he want? Bell picked up his coat. To show me something. What? I don't know. Mrs. Bell studied his face. You do. Bell paused at the door. I know that whoever telephoned me last night was not asking whether I recognized Julian Hargreaves. What was she asking? He opened the door. She was asking whether I would admit that I did. Before Bell reached the gate, Mrs. Bell called after him, Arthur. He turned. If Inspector Price asks whether you are certain about the voice, do not say yes merely because you are annoyed. I am rarely annoyed. You are. And if he asks whether Mr. Hargreaves could have spoken after you certified him, Bell looked towards the houses. He could not. That is what I thought. He gave her a smile. Stay away from the telephone. Why? Because apparently it has developed an interest in the dead. Mrs. Bell watched him walk down the path. At the corner he passed Miss Dalloway, who was carrying washing and staring at him with the innocence of somebody who had been waiting for this opportunity. Morning, Doctor. Good morning. Off to Mr. Hargreaves's? Yes. Police business? I imagine so. Miss Dalloway nodded gravely. I thought so. She moved aside. Bell continued towards the square. Behind him, Miss Dalloway turned towards her house. By lunchtime, she would tell 3 people that the doctor had looked frightened. He had not. But in Wetherby, accuracy was often less useful than confidence. Dr. Bell found Inspector Price standing beneath the porch of Hargreaves's house, speaking to Constable Marsh. The inspector looked up as Bell approached and gave him the expression of a man who had been expecting precisely the amount of trouble currently available. You came quickly. You sounded persuasive. I try not to. Price opened the front door. On the hall table stood a silver tray. Beside it was a cup, untouched, with a thin skin of tea across its surface. Price pointed to it. Found at 8 this morning. Bell examined it without touching. Fresh. Fresh enough. Who prepared it? We have not found anyone who admits to doing so. That is not quite the same as saying nobody did. No, it is more useful. Bell looked at him. Price continued quietly. Yesterday afternoon, after you left, Hargreaves telephoned the village garage. He ordered his car brought round for 9:30. That is odd. Why? He was dead. He was alive when he made the arrangement. Bell frowned. Yesterday afternoon? At 4:20, Bell calculated. I certified his death at 4:40. Correct. Then he made the call before I arrived. Yes, that is hardly suspicious. No, except that the garage owner says Hargreaves told him someone was coming to the house at 9. Bell turned. Who? He did not say. Price walked into the drawing room. On the mantelpiece stood a row of framed photographs. Hargreaves at a council dinner. Hargreaves beside a fishing boat. Hargreaves shaking hands with a local member of Parliament. In every photograph he looked mildly dissatisfied, as though the photographer had inconvenienced him. He had plans for last night, Bell said. Apparently. Who knew? Quite a few people, perhaps. Price lifted a notebook. That is where the trouble begins, he read from it. At 7:15, Mrs. Vale says she saw a man entering through the side gate. Which man? She thought it was Mr. Hargreaves. Could it have been? Possibly. But she knows he was dead. She knows now. Bell looked towards the window. Mrs. Vale is not imaginative. No, she is merely observant when it suits her. Who else saw him? Mr. Cole, the baker, heard the side gate at about 7:20. He did not see anyone. Price closed the notebook. Then there is Mr. Finch. Bell recognized the name. His solicitor? Yes. What does he say? That he came here at 8:30. Bell looked at him sharply. He admits it? He does. Why? That is the interesting part. Price walked towards the telephone in the hall. Mr. Finch says Hargreaves invited him. Did he speak to him? No. Then how did he know he was invited? He received a note. Where is it? Missing. Bell stared at him. Convenient. Very. Did Finch enter the house? He says he did. And what happened? He waited in the drawing room for 10 minutes. Then he left. Why? He says nobody came downstairs. Bell looked again at the untouched tea. And he did not find that strange? Apparently, he was more concerned about being late for dinner. Bell gave a faint smile. That sounds like Finch. You know him well. Enough to know that punctuality is his religion. Price smiled. Then perhaps you can explain something. What? Why a man who had been invited to meet Hargreaves at 8:30 would leave at 20 to 9 without asking where his host was. Bell considered this. Perhaps he did not want to meet him. That is one possibility. And the other, Price looked towards the staircase. That he already had. Bell followed his gaze. The house seemed suddenly smaller. Meaning Mr. Finch may not have come here to see Hargreaves. Then whom? Price did not answer. Instead, he moved to the telephone. Last night, someone called you. Yes. And shortly afterwards, someone called here. Was it Hargreaves? No, who was it? Price looked at him. The caller asked for Mr. Finch. Bell felt the significance before he understood it. Finch was here. Yes. Yet the caller did not ask for him here. No. Where did he ask for him? Price's expression became almost sympathetic. At the garage. Bell stared at the inspector. So someone expected Finch to leave this house. Perhaps. And someone knew he had been here. Perhaps. Bell turned towards the front window. You said there was something beside the telephone. Price nodded. It is still there. He opened the drawer beneath the hall table. Inside lay a small sheet of paper. Bell read the writing. There were only 6 words. Tell Arthur he must listen. Bell read it twice. Who wrote this? We do not know. When was it written? Yesterday. By Hargreaves. Price shook his head. His handwriting was checked. Bell looked at the paper again. There was something wrong with it. Not the words, the familiarity. He raised his eyes. Inspector, yes? Where was this found? Beside the telephone. Not inside the drawer. No. Bell looked at the drawer. Then why did you put it there? Price was silent for a moment. Because when I found it, Doctor, the telephone was ringing. Neither man moved. Did you answer? No. Why not? Price gave the smallest shrug. Because I had already heard the voice. Bell felt the cold return. The same voice? Yes. Julian Hargreaves. Price looked at him. No. Bell waited. The voice of a man who expected to be heard. For the first time that morning, the inspector's mild manner disappeared. Dr. Bell, I think someone has been using Hargreaves's death to make certain people behave exactly as they were expected to behave. Bell looked down at the note. And Mr. Finch? Price picked it up carefully. I think he was the first person to understand that. Outside, the church clock struck 11. The sound traveled through the wet village and faded. Neither man mentioned that there were now 2 people in Wetherby who had heard a dead man's voice. Nor did either mention the more troubling possibility that the voice had never belonged to the dead man at all. The 3 accounts of the evening had one useful quality. None of them agreed. Nobody in Wetherby considered that unusual, which was its own difficulty. Inspector Price discovered this within an hour of speaking to the people concerned. He did not regard disagreement as unusual. In Wetherby, 3 witnesses could watch the same rainstorm and later provide 3 different opinions about whether the pavement had been wet. Mrs. Vale was interviewed first. You saw a man enter the side gate? Price asked. Yes. At what time? About 7. 7 exactly? No. I have better things to do than watch clocks. Price smiled. Of course. Mrs. Vale folded her hands. It was Mr. Hargreaves. You are certain? I knew his walk. Could you see his face? No. Then how did you recognize him? The shoulders. Price wrote something down. His shoulders? He had a particular way of carrying them. Bell, who had accompanied Price, looked towards the window. Mrs. Vale noticed. Doctors notice people too. Usually when they are ill, Bell said. I notice them when they are lying. Price glanced up. Was Mr. Hargreaves lying? Mrs. Vale frowned. You know what I mean. I am beginning to. She leaned forward. The man stopped at the gate. Why? He looked back. At you? No. At the house. And then, he went inside. Did you see him leave? No. That was the first version. The second came from Mr. Cole at the bakery. He had not seen the visitor, but he had heard the gate. It squeaks, he explained. So you know when it opens. Everyone knows when it opens. Did you hear footsteps? No. Voices? No. Anything unusual? Cole considered. The kitchen light came on. When? Just after 7. Price looked at Bell. Was it usually on? No, Bell said. Hargreaves preferred the dining room. Cole nodded. That is what I thought. You knew his habits. I supplied his bread. What time did the light go off? Price asked. 7:40. Then what? Nothing. Nothing at all. The church clock struck 8. And? The kitchen light came on again. Price stopped writing. Who was inside? Cole shrugged. If I knew that, Inspector, I suppose I would be more useful. The third account belonged to Finch. He was a thin, careful man. I arrived at 8:30, he said. You entered through the front door? Yes. Unlocked? Yes. Did you knock? I did. No answer? No. Yet you entered. Finch adjusted his spectacles. I had been invited. By Mr. Hargreaves? Yes. By note? Yes. Where is the note? I destroyed it. Why? Finch looked genuinely surprised. Because it was private. Price waited. I suppose that sounds foolish now. Only slightly. I had business with Julian. What kind? Finch hesitated. Personal. Bell watched him. Finch noticed. You knew him for years, Doctor. Yes. You know he had a difficult temperament. Very. He was angry with me. Why? Finch looked towards the fireplace. I cannot tell you. Price did not press him. Instead he asked, when you entered the house, what did you hear? Nothing. Did you see the telephone? Yes. Was the receiver in place? Finch frowned. I think so. You think? I was not inspecting it. What did you do? I waited. For 10 minutes. Perhaps 15. Then you left. Yes. Why? Finch looked almost embarrassed. I heard somebody upstairs. Bell straightened. You said you heard nothing. I heard nothing when I entered. And afterwards. A floorboard creaked. Did you call out? No. Why not? Finch looked at him. Because I thought it was Julian. That answer altered the room. Price closed his notebook. What made you think he was upstairs? The sound. What sound? A cough. Bell felt his attention sharpen. What sort of cough? Finch looked at him. The sort he always made. For a moment, nobody spoke. Hargreaves had suffered from a chronic cough for years. It was dry, brief, and irritatingly precise. Bell had heard it hundreds of times. You are certain? Bell asked. Finch nodded. I heard it twice. Could you have been mistaken? Doctor, I have been mistaken about many things, not that. Price leaned back. Did you go upstairs? No. Why not? Finch gave a small, humorless smile. I had no wish to surprise a man who was angry with me. That was the second oddity. The first had been the telephone. The second was that a dead man had apparently been heard coughing upstairs after his death. Yet Bell was less disturbed by the cough than by something else. He turned to Price. Did you examine the staircase? Yes. And? There was dust on the upper landing. Footprints? None. Bell frowned. Finch looked uncomfortable. Price closed his notebook again. There is another matter. He reached into his coat and produced a small envelope. This was found in Finch's car. Finch stared at it. I have never seen that. Bell looked at Price. What is it? A telephone bill. For Hargreaves's number. Why was it in Finch's car? That, Price said, is the question. Finch stood. I can explain. Price raised a hand. I am sure you can. Finch sat down. Outside, a delivery van rattled past the bakery. The village sounded ordinary. That was what troubled Bell most. There had been no storm, no quarrel in the street, no broken window, no hurried footsteps. Only 3 people describing an ordinary evening. Yet in each account, the same house seemed to contain a different man. To Mrs. Vale, Hargreaves had entered. To Mr. Cole, someone had used his kitchen. To Finch, someone had coughed upstairs. Bell looked at the 3 statements lying on the table. They cannot all be true, he said. Price shook his head. No, he gathered the papers. They can. Bell looked at him. Then what? Price stood. They may simply be describing three different moments. And that means, Price walked towards the door, that our evening began earlier than we thought. Bell followed him into the hall. Neither noticed Mrs. Vale watching from across the road. She had been watching the house since 7 that evening, but she had not been watching Hargreaves. She had been watching the gate. The flower pot stood beneath the kitchen window, an ugly blue thing which Mrs. Hargreaves had bought at a jumble sale and never managed to throw away. Price noticed it because it was raining. Most people would have noticed the locked back door, the disturbed telephone, or the fact that a dead man's house seemed to have acquired a number of visitors. Price noticed the flower pot. He crouched beside it. Bell stood under the porch. Something wrong? Possibly. Price moved the pot aside. Beneath it was a brass key. Bell stared. That was not there yesterday. No. You are certain? I saw the flower pots when I left. Price picked up the key with his handkerchief. Then someone put it here afterwards. Bell looked towards the kitchen window. What does it open? That is what we are going to discover. They searched the house first. The key fitted nothing in the kitchen. It did not fit the back door, pantry, cellar, or the small cupboard beneath the stairs. Price tried the study. Nothing. The drawing room cabinet. Nothing. Finally, they reached the upstairs landing. There were 4 doors. 3 were bedrooms. The 4th was a narrow linen cupboard. The key turned in its lock. Inside were sheets, blankets, 2 broken lamps, and a cardboard box containing Christmas decorations. Bell looked disappointed. Price did not. He reached behind the box and pulled out a second key. This is becoming expensive, Bell said. Price smiled. Keys rarely travel alone. The second key was larger. It opened the cellar. They descended. The air smelled of damp stone and old coal. At the bottom stood a wooden cabinet. Bell recognized it. Hargreaves kept wine there. Price opened it. There were 6 bottles, 3 empty crates, and a small leather case. Inside the case was a portable tape recorder. Bell said nothing. He was thinking of the call, of the pause before the voice spoke, and of the certainty he had felt. Recognition had been immediate enough. Memory was often untidy, but that voice had arrived with the precision of a face seen through glass. He wondered whether that certainty was what somebody counted on. Price understood, but did not comment. He closed it and put the key beside the recorder. Bell stared at it. That seemed significant. Very. Price examined the machine. There was a cassette inside. He did not play it. Instead, he looked at Bell. Did Hargreaves own this? Not to my knowledge. Could he have? Anyone could have. Price nodded. That is the difficulty with knowledge. He placed the recorder in his coat pocket. Then Bell noticed something. There. A strip of paper had been tucked behind the cabinet. Price pulled it free. Only one sentence had been written. After 9, use the kitchen telephone. Bell read it twice. Someone planned the evening. Yes. And they left instructions. Yes. Why hide them? Price looked towards the stairs. Perhaps they were not meant to be found. They returned upstairs. The telephone sat quietly on the hall table. Bell stared at it. Play the tape. Price shook his head. Not yet. Why? Because if that machine contains the voice you heard, I want to know what else happened before we hear it. Bell frowned. You think there is another explanation? I think there are always several. The front door opened. Both men turned. Constable Marsh entered, wet from the rain. Inspector. Yes? I have spoken to Mrs. Vale. And? She has changed her story. Price sighed. Of course she has. She says she did not see Hargreaves. Who did she see? Marsh hesitated. She says she saw a woman. Bell felt his attention sharpen. What woman? She cannot say. Price looked at the flower pot through the window. Did she mention the gate? Yes. What about it? She says the woman left something behind. Bell looked at Price. The key? No. Marsh reached into his pocket. A glove. He held up a small grey glove. Bell recognized it immediately. That belongs to Mrs. Finch. Nobody spoke. Mrs. Finch was Julian Hargreaves's niece. She had told the police that she had spent the entire evening at home. Price took the glove. Where was it found? Behind the flower pot. Belle looked again at the blue pot. The key had been hidden beneath it. The glove had been found behind it. Two objects, deliberately concealed or accidentally lost, depending upon which explanation one preferred. Price slipped the glove into an evidence bag. "Tell me," Belle said, "why would Mrs. Finch come here after Hargreaves died?" Price looked at him. "That is the wrong question." "Why?" "Because we do not yet know that she came here." Belle glanced towards the flower pot. "The glove says otherwise." "No." Price pointed towards the kitchen window. "The glove says someone wanted us to think she came here." Belle considered this. "And the key?" Price looked towards the house. "The key says someone expected us to open something, such as the cellar, perhaps. And the tape recorder." Price smiled faintly. "That tells us someone expected us to listen." A car passed on the road outside. Neither man moved. The village seemed suddenly full of closed doors, careful curtains, and people remembering things they had forgotten to mention. Price turned to Marsh. "Find Mrs. Finch, and if she is at home, ask her whether she owns a grey glove." Marsh nodded. "And if she says yes, ask her why she has only one." Marsh left. Belle watched him go. "You think she is involved?" "I think she is involved in something." "That sounds different." "It is." Price returned his attention to the cellar key. "Doctor, there is one thing about people in small villages that is often overlooked." "What is that?" "They rarely hide one secret when they can hide three." Belle smiled despite himself. "And which secret are we looking for?" Price looked at the telephone. "The one that required a dead man to sound alive." The conversation with Mrs. Finch took place in the kitchen because Inspector Price had discovered that people lied more comfortably in sitting rooms. She arrived at 11:40, carrying a handbag and wearing one grey glove. Price noticed this. He did not mention it. "Tea?" Mrs. Finch asked. "No, thank you. I wasn't offering." Price looked at Belle. Belle looked at the ceiling. Mrs. Finch sat down. "You wanted to see me?" "Yes." "About Julian? About yesterday evening?" She removed her glove. "Of course." Price opened his notebook. "Where were you at 7? "At home." "Alone?" "Yes." "What were you doing?" "Reading." "What?" "A novel." "Which novel?" Mrs. Finch smiled. "Inspector, are you investigating a murder or my taste in literature?" "Neither, at present." "Then why ask?" "Because people often remember books better than times." She considered him. "I was reading a detective story." "Appropriate." "Not especially." The detective was rather pompous. Price made a note. Mrs. Finch watched him. "You don't believe me?" "I haven't decided." "Did Julian die naturally?" Belle answered. "Yes." Mrs. Finch turned towards him. "You're certain?" "I was there." "And you are the doctor?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Then I suppose he did." Price noticed the slight emphasis on suppose. "You visited him yesterday afternoon?" "Yes." "At what time?" "About 3. "Why?" "He asked me to come." "What did he want?" "To discuss money." "Your money?" "His." Price waited. Mrs. Finch folded her hands. "Julian had changed his will." Belle glanced at her. "When?" "I don't know." "Did he tell you?" "He said he intended to." "Were you pleased?" "No." "Were you angry?" "I was disappointed." Price closed the notebook. "That is an unusually honest answer. I don't see the advantage of pretending otherwise." "Quite." He looked towards the window. "You said you went home at 4. "Yes." "Did you return?" "No." "Your glove was found here." She looked down at her hands. For the first time, her expression changed. "I have lost one." "We noticed." "Where was it found?" "Behind the flower pot." She smiled faintly. "Then I suppose I must have been there." "You don't remember?" "No." Price said nothing. Mrs. Finch looked at Belle. "Do you believe that?" Belle hesitated. "I believe people lose things. Even gloves. Especially gloves." She almost laughed. Price rose. "Thank you. That is all? For now." Mrs. Finch stood. At the door she stopped. "Inspector?" "Yes." "Did Julian telephone anyone last night?" Price studied her. "Why?" "He told me he expected a call." "From whom?" "I don't know." "When did he tell you?" "Yesterday." "Before or after you discussed the will?" "After." Price's expression remained neutral. What exactly did he say? Mrs. Finch thought. He said that if the telephone rang after 9, the person calling would know what to ask. Belle felt a chill. What did he mean? I don't know. Did he sound frightened? No. Angry? No. What then? Mrs. Finch looked towards the hall. Prepared. She left. Price waited until the front door closed. Belle spoke first. She knew about the telephone. Yes. She also knew about the will. Yes. Do you think she killed him? No. Belle looked surprised. You don't? I think she is telling us something. What? That Julian was expecting someone. But he was dead. Exactly. Price returned to the kitchen table. Now we have 3 people who knew something about that telephone. Finch, Mrs. Finch, and the caller. And you. Belle frowned. I knew nothing. You recognized the voice. That isn't knowledge. It is now. The telephone rang. Neither man moved. It rang again. Price looked at Belle. Answer it. Belle picked up the receiver. Dr. Bell. There was silence. Then a man's voice said, You have been asking the wrong questions. Belle's face tightened. Who is this? The caller breathed quietly. You asked who came to the house. Yes. You should ask who was already there. The line went dead. Belle replaced the receiver. Price remained still. What did he say? Belle repeated the words. Price walked to the window. Outside, Mrs. Finch was crossing the square. She stopped beside the church gate. For a moment, she looked back at the house. Then she continued walking. Price watched her disappear. Who was already there? Belle asked. Price did not answer. Instead, he looked at the kitchen table. A teacup stood beside Mrs. Finch's chair. She had not touched it. Yet there was a faint mark on its rim. Lipstick. Belle noticed it too. She doesn't wear lipstick. Price nodded. That, he said, is our first useful piece of nothing. He picked up the cup. And in this village, nothing is usually where somebody has carefully put it. The rain began again before noon. By then, Inspector Price had stopped asking who had entered the house. He was beginning to wonder who had never left. Price carried the cup into the drawing room and placed it beside the telephone. Lipstick proves very little, Belle said. Quite. A woman could have used it yesterday. She could. Or today. Possibly. Then why call it useful? Because Mrs. Finch did not drink from it. Belle looked at him. How do you know? She told us. She did. No. Belle smiled. Price put the cup into an evidence bag. You seem remarkably calm, Belle said. I have learned that excitement makes facts look more interesting than they are. And suspicion? Suspicion is useful. It prevents us from becoming comfortable. The telephone remained silent. For several minutes they stood without speaking. It was an uncomfortable silence, but not an empty one. Somewhere in the house, a pipe clicked as it cooled. A clock on the landing ticked with irritating confidence. Outside, a dog barked once and was immediately silenced by its owner. Then Price said, There is another possibility. Belle turned. What? That the caller wants us to believe someone is still in the house. Belle looked towards the stairs. You mean hiding? No. Then what? Price looked at the telephone. I mean remembered. Belle frowned. Price did not explain. For once, Belle wished the inspector would explain something before it became more troubling. Price's last remark stayed with Belle as they left Hargreaves's house. He had heard it as an explanation, but by the time they reached the square, it had become a question. What do you mean by remembered? Belle asked. Price glanced at him. I mean that voices can survive people. That sounds unnecessarily poetic. Does it? Belle stopped beneath the awning of the chemist's shop. You think the voice was recorded? I think it might have been, but I recognized it. Yes, exactly. Price waited. Belle looked irritated. That voice was Julian. I know. You cannot record a man and make him answer a question he never heard. No. Then why? Belle stopped. Something had occurred to him. He remembered the first call, the pause, the breathing, the word Arthur. He had been so certain of the voice that he had ignored the one thing that did not belong to it. The caller had not answered his question. Inspector. Yes? When I asked who it was, he said nothing. Price nodded. I noticed. I thought the silence meant he was frightened. And now? Bell looked back towards Hargreaves's house. Now I think he was waiting. For what? For me to recognize him. Price's expression changed slightly. Go on. Bell spoke slowly. The voice did not need to convince me. It only needed to make me remember. Remember what? Hargreaves. Price said nothing. Bell continued. Julian had a particular way of saying my name. He used to call me Arthur whenever he wanted something. Not Doctor, Arthur. And the recording. Bell shook his head. No, that is where I was wrong. Price waited. I have heard that voice hundreds of times, but the caller did not imitate his ordinary speech. He imitated the version of Julian they expected to hear. Price smiled faintly. Now you are getting somewhere. Bell looked annoyed. I am not pleased about it. I rarely am when people discover something useful. They resumed walking. At the corner, Bell stopped again. There is something else. Yes? When Julian was dying yesterday, he asked me whether I had received a telephone call. Price turned. Before he died? Yes. What did you tell him? That I had not. And did he say why he asked? Bell frowned. I thought he was confused. Were you? Yes. About what? Bell looked towards the church. His voice. Price waited. Bell's memory shifted. The room, the curtains, the smell of disinfectant, Hargreaves lying in bed, pale but conscious. He had spoken only a few sentences, yet one had seemed strange. You will hear from me later, Hargreaves had said. Bell had assumed he meant a message. Now he understood the wording. Not, I will telephone, not, I shall see you, you will hear from me. Bell closed his eyes briefly. He knew. Price's voice was quiet. What did he know? That somebody intended to use his voice. Did he tell you? No. Then how can you be certain? Because he smiled. Price considered that. Was it his usual smile? Bell looked at him. No. What sort? The smile of a man who has just arranged something unpleasant for somebody else. Price nodded. That sounds like Hargreaves. Bell almost laughed. Then his expression hardened. I need to correct my statement. Which one? I told you the voice on the telephone was Hargreaves. Yes, it wasn't. Price did not look surprised. Who was it? I don't know. That is a useful answer. Bell frowned. I don't usually give useful answers. Most people do not. They continued towards the surgery. At the door, Bell stopped. One more thing. Price turned. The caller knew I would recognize the voice. Yes. He also knew I would doubt myself afterwards. Yes. Why? Price looked at the closed surgery door. Because doubt is much easier to control than certainty. Bell considered this. Then he remembered something else. The woman. What woman? The second caller. What about her? She did not ask whether I had heard Julian. Price waited. She asked whether I had heard him. There was a pause. Bell's face changed. That distinction matters. It might. No, it does. Why? Because she never named him. Price looked at Bell carefully. You are saying she knew the voice without knowing who it belonged to? No. Bell shook his head. I am saying she expected me to supply the name. Price smiled. And now you have changed your mind. Yes. About the voice? No. Bell looked back at the road. About the person who wanted me to recognize it. Price waited. Bell's voice became quieter. I don't think they wanted me to identify the dead man. What did they want? Price looked at him. I think they wanted me to remember the living one. He walked across the square instead of following Bell inside. Mr. Cole was arranging loaves with concentration. Busy morning, Price said. Cole nodded. Very. Did you see anyone near the Finch house? No. Price smiled. You answered rather quickly. Cole looked at him. I have been asked the question already. By whom? The constable. And what did you tell him? That I saw nothing. Price glanced at the windows. Nothing is becoming popular. Cole gave a nervous laugh. People talk endlessly. They always do. About the voice. Price stopped. Cole's face had gone pale. What voice? You tell me. Cole looked towards the road. I heard it. When? Last night. From where? Cole hesitated. Across the square. Whose voice? Cole swallowed. I thought it was Mr. Hargreaves. Price nodded. And now? Now I think I was meant to think that. Price left him with that. The investigation had acquired something useful than evidence. It had acquired a witness who knew he had been deceived. Mrs. Bell was waiting when Arthur returned to the surgery. She had brought him lunch, which was her usual method of dealing with situations she considered too complicated for conversation. There was soup in a flask, 2 sandwiches, and an apple. "You have been gone 3 hours," she said. "I have been investigating." "No, Inspector Price has been investigating. You have been standing beside him, looking worried." "I was not worried." "You have your worried face." "I have several faces." "Only 2. Bell removed his coat. "What are the 2? "One for patients, and one for people who are wasting your time." "And which am I wearing now?" "The second." He smiled. Then he noticed that she was holding the telephone receiver. He stopped. "Who called?" "Nobody." "Then why are you holding it?" "I was listening." "To what?" "The line." Bell looked at her. Mrs. Bell put the receiver down. There was a noise. "What sort?" "A click." "That could be anything." "Yes." She opened the flask. "Which is why I ignored it." Bell sat down. "You should not have touched the telephone." "I know. You could have disturbed something." "I know. You could have—" "Arthur." He stopped. She pushed the soup towards him. "You are becoming tiresome." He began eating. For a minute, neither spoke. Then Mrs. Bell said, "The voice last night wasn't quite right." Bell looked up. "You said it was Hargreaves." "I know." "You said you were certain." "I know." She stirred her tea. "But I remember something now." Bell put down his spoon. "What?" "When he said your name." "Arthur?" "Yes." "What about it?" "He said it too quickly." Bell frowned. "That doesn't mean anything." "It does." "How?" "Julian never said your name quickly." Bell stared at her. She continued. "He always paused first." Bell remembered. It was true. Hargreaves had a peculiar habit when addressing him. He would say, "Arthur," after a small breath, almost as though preparing to make a request. The caller had not done that. The caller had spoken the name cleanly. Immediately, Bell leaned back. "Why didn't you tell me this last night?" "Because I didn't remember it." "When did you remember?" "This morning." "What made you remember?" Mrs. Bell looked towards the window. "Your coat." "My coat? You left it over the chair." Bell waited. "I noticed the smell." He looked puzzled. "Of what?" "Smoke." "I was nowhere near a fire." "You were at Hargreaves's house." "Yes." "And his study always smelled of tobacco." "Hargreaves smoked cigars." "Not last night." Bell considered her. Then he understood. The caller had spoken from somewhere. Somewhere with no smoke. Somewhere else. "Did you hear anything behind the voice?" he asked. Mrs. Bell nodded, very faintly. "What?" "A clock." Bell stood. "What sort?" "A grandfather clock." Hargreaves had no grandfather clock. His house contained a small brass mantel clock and a modern electric clock in the kitchen. "Are you certain?" "Yes." "What did it sound like?" "Slow." Bell stared at her. Slow? The chimes were slow. He thought of the village. Only 3 houses possessed grandfather clocks. Mrs. Bell saw his expression. "You have thought of somewhere." "Yes." "Where?" "The vicarage." She shook her head. "Too obvious." Bell looked at her. "Why?" "Because Reverend Hale's clock is broken." "How do you know?" "I asked him to repair it 3 years ago." "Why?" "It was annoying." Mrs. Bell smiled. "And he never did." Bell sat again. "There are other clocks." "Of course. But you recognize the sound." "I recognize the rhythm." "That is not the same thing." "No." She leaned forward. "Arthur, there was something else." He waited. When the second caller spoke, she was breathing heavily. "I remember." "No." Mrs. Bell shook her head. "You heard her breathing. I heard what happened after." "What?" She stopped. Bell frowned. "Stopped breathing?" "For a moment." "Why?" "She heard something." "What?" "I don't know." Mrs. Bell looked towards the surgery door. But whoever she was not alone. Bell felt a coldness settle over him. "You're certain?" "Yes." "What makes you certain?" "Because somebody whispered." "What did they say?" "I couldn't hear the words." "Nothing?" "One word." Bell waited. "Arthur." He stared at her. "Another person said my name?" Mrs. Bell nodded. But it wasn't the woman. Bell stood again. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because you were busy insisting you knew whose voice it was. That silenced him. Mrs. Bell looked almost sympathetic. You were frightened. I was not. You were. I was confused. Doctors are often frightened by confusion. Bell gave her a tired smile. Who said you could become philosophical? 31 years of marriage. The telephone rang. Neither moved. It rang again. Mrs. Bell looked at Arthur. This time, she said, you answer it. Bell approached slowly. He lifted the receiver. Dr. Bell. Nothing. Then a faint sound. Not a voice. A clock. One chime. Then another. Bell listened. 3, 4. He looked at his wife. She was pale. The chimes stopped. A man's voice spoke. Not Hargreaves. Not the voice from the previous night. A younger voice, calm, almost amused. You should ask your wife what she remembered before breakfast. The line went dead. Bell remained with the receiver in his hand. Mrs. Bell had heard enough. What did he say? Bell looked at her. He knew you had remembered something. She did not answer. For the first time since the calls began, she looked genuinely unsettled. Arthur, she said quietly, there is something I did not tell you. He waited. When I heard the voice last night, I thought I recognized it too. Bell's expression changed. Whose? She looked towards the telephone. I don't know. That isn't an answer. It is the only one I have. Try again. Mrs. Bell closed her eyes. The voice sounded like someone I knew. Who? I cannot remember. You just said you recognized it. I recognized the way he spoke. Bell sat beside her. Then think. She did. For nearly a minute she said nothing. Rain tapped softly against the window. Finally she opened her eyes. It was not a man's voice I recognized. Bell waited. It was the voice of a man pretending to be another man. That isn't what I asked. I know. She looked directly at him. I recognized the person doing the pretending. Bell felt his stomach tighten. Who? Mrs. Bell shook her head. I don't know his name. But you know him? Yes. From where? She looked towards the door. From here. Bell understood the significance immediately. The caller had not merely known about the house. He had known about them, their habits, their memories, their voices, and perhaps, most troubling of all, the things they had forgotten. Mrs. Bell picked up the telephone receiver again. This time she held it as though it were something fragile. Arthur? Yes. I think the dead man was never the important part. Bell looked at her. What was? She listened to the silence on the line. The person who knew exactly what voice I would trust. Price arrived at the surgery 10 minutes later, having been summoned by a message Mrs. Bell had sent through the baker's boy. He listened without interruption, while Bell described the latest call. The voice was younger, Bell said, and Mrs. Bell believes she recognized the speaker? Not exactly. Price looked at her. What do you remember? Mrs. Bell folded her hands. A habit. Whose? I don't know. That is unfortunate. I know. Price smiled faintly. Most useful memories begin that way. She thought for a moment. The man on the telephone breathed before speaking. Like Hargreaves? No. Hargreaves cleared his throat. Did this man? No. He inhaled through his nose. Bell looked at Price. That sounds insignificant. Everything is insignificant until it isn't. Price took out his notebook. Can you imitate it? Mrs. Bell frowned, then gave a quiet imitation, a short breath, followed by a pause. Bell stared at her. I know that. Where from? Price asked. He answered before she could. The council meetings. Mrs. Bell nodded. There was a man who always did that. Who? Bell began to say the name, then stopped. Price noticed. You know him? Yes. Who? Peter Cole. The baker? Yes. Mrs. Bell shook her head. No, not him. Bell looked confused. He has the same habit. Many people breathe. Not like that. Price leaned back. Then who? Mrs. Bell looked towards the window. Mr. Finch. Bell frowned. The solicitor? Yes. Price wrote the name down. Why would Finch imitate Hargreaves? I don't know. Could he imitate him? Bell considered it. Probably. Why? Hargreaves had a distinctive voice. That is not what I asked. Bell looked at him. Finch spent years dealing with him. He would know his speech. Price closed the notebook. Then we should hear Mr. Finch speak. They found him at his office above the bank. He looked irritated when Price entered. I have already answered your questions. I have another. I am working. So am I. Finch sighed. What now? Price sat opposite him. Please say my name. Finch blinked. Inspector Price. Again. Inspector Price. Price looked at Bell. Thank you. Finch stared at them. What was that about? Nothing. Bell spoke. Mr. Finch, did you telephone me last night? No. Did you telephone Dr. Bell? Price asked. No. Did you use Hargreaves's telephone? No. Were you at his house after 9? Finch's face tightened. No. You are certain? Yes. Price waited. Finch looked away. Why do you keep asking the same question? Because people often change their answer when the question becomes inconvenient. Finch stood. I have nothing more to say. Price did not stop him. Instead, he asked quietly, when did you learn to imitate Julian Hargreaves? Finch froze. Bell watched him. I don't know what you mean. You have been speaking like him. No, not now. Finch looked at Bell. Doctor? Bell said nothing. Price continued. Last night, the voice on the telephone used a phrase Hargreaves commonly used when he wanted somebody to agree with him. Finch swallowed. I didn't call him. We did not ask whether you called him. Price stood. We asked whether you called the doctor. Finch sat again. I did not. Then why are you frightened? I am not frightened. Price smiled. Of course. Bell noticed something then. Finch's right hand was trembling. Not much. Enough. Where were you at 9? Bell asked. At home. Alone? Yes. Your wife? At her sister's. Anyone else? No. Price looked towards the desk. A small tape recorder sat beside a stack of legal papers. Bell noticed it too. Do you record your meetings? Sometimes. Your telephone calls? No. Price pointed at it. May I? Finch hesitated. Then he handed it over. Price examined the machine. The tape is missing. I removed it. When? Yesterday. Why? I don't remember. Price looked at Bell. Bell felt a strange certainty settle over him. He knew that hesitation. He had heard it before. Not from Finch. From Hargreaves. The same pause. The same slight movement of the mouth before answering. Bell suddenly understood what had been troubling him. The voice had never been perfect. It had only been familiar. Inspector, he said quietly, we have been listening for the wrong resemblance. Price turned. Bell looked at Finch. The caller did not sound exactly like Hargreaves. Finch said nothing. He sounded like someone who had spent a very long time listening to Hargreaves. Price's expression sharpened. And who had access to his voice? Finch's silence became an answer of its own. Bell stepped closer. You recorded him. Finch looked at the desk. No, you did. I recorded meetings. With Hargreaves, Finch finally looked up. For years, Price held out his hand. The tapes. There are none. That is not true. Finch's face changed. For the first time, the polite solicitor looked old. There is one. Where? In the church. Why? Finch closed his eyes. Because Julian told me to hide it. Price and Bell exchanged a glance. What is on it? Price asked. Finch whispered, the last conversation Julian had before he died. Who was with him? I don't know. You were there? Yes. Then you do know. Finch shook his head. I heard the voice. Whose? He looked at Bell. The doctor's. Bell went still. That is impossible. Finch gave a tired smile. I know. Price's voice remained calm. Then perhaps the tape will tell us why. And for the first time, nobody in the room suggested that the dead man had been speaking. Price paused briefly. Finch nodded. What was he afraid of? Finch looked at Bell. Being believed. The inspector studied him for several seconds, then he opened the door. That, he said, is the first sensible thing anyone has said all morning. The church was empty when they arrived, which Bell thought appropriate. Nothing in the village was ever truly empty, of course. A church contained its flowers, its dust, its records, and the accumulated expectations of people who believed silence must be occupied by something important. But there was no one in the nave, and the rain against the stained glass windows sounded louder than footsteps. Finch led them to the vestry. He carried no key. "The door is open," Price observed. "The vicar dislikes locking it." "Why?" "He says people should be trusted." Price looked at Bell. "Has that worked?" "Not often." Behind a row of hymn books stood a narrow cupboard. Finch removed 3 books, reached behind them, and took out a small wooden box. "This?" Price asked. "Yes." He opened it. Inside lay a cassette, nothing else. Price held it between his fingers. Why hide one tape in a church? Finch looked towards the nave. Because Julian thought nobody would search somewhere they believed he respected. Bell almost smiled. That sounds exactly like him. Price placed the cassette into the recorder he had brought from Hargreaves's cellar. Bell noticed the connection. "The machine?" "Yes." "So this is the recorder you found?" "It is." "And you still haven't played the other tape?" "No." "Why?" "Because I prefer answers in the correct order." Finch gave a quiet laugh. Price looked at him. "Was that amusing?" "No, Inspector." "Good." He pressed the button. For several seconds there was only static. Then Julian Hargreaves spoke. Not from beyond death. Not through a telephone. Simply from the past. His voice filled the vestry. "Are you certain?" Another man answered. Bell recognized his own voice. "Yes." He went rigid. The recording continued. "You have told nobody?" "No." "Not even your wife?" A pause. "No." Bell looked at Price. "I never said that." Price raised one hand. The tape continued. Hargreaves spoke again. "Then you understand what will happen." Bell's recorded voice answered. "I understand." The machine clicked. The tape ended. Nobody spoke. Price rewound it. Bell stared at the recorder. "That isn't me." Finch looked at him. "It sounds like you." "It isn't me. I heard it yesterday." "Where?" "Hargreaves's study." "Yesterday?" Finch nodded. "Before you arrived." Bell turned to Price. "He is lying." "Perhaps." Price rewound the tape again. "Listen." Bell did. This time he did not listen for his own voice. He listened to the pauses, the breath before the words, the small hesitation after certain. His face changed. Price noticed. "What is it?" Bell looked at him. "The voice is wrong." "How?" "It says the words correctly." Finch frowned. "That is a strange objection." "Because I would never say them like that." Price nodded. "Exactly." Bell stared at the recorder. "You knew." "I suspected." "Since when?" "Since the call to your surgery." Bell sat down heavily on the wooden bench. For a moment, he seemed less like a doctor than a man being asked to remember his own life in the wrong order. Price turned to Finch. "Who else knew this tape existed?" Finch looked down. "Julian." "Obviously." "Me. Who else?" "No one." Price waited. Finch swallowed. "Mrs. Finch." Bell looked up. "She knew?" "She found me hiding it." "When?" "Yesterday evening." "Before she went to Hargreaves's house?" Finch's silence lasted too long. Price sighed. "You see why I prefer questions?" Finch nodded. "Yes. Did she go there?" "I don't know. You gave us a better answer yesterday." Finch looked miserable. "I lied." Again, familiar territory. Bell stood. "What is the explanation?" Price turned towards him. "The quiet one." "I dislike that phrase." "I know." Price lifted the cassette. "This was designed to make you believe you had said something you had never said." Bell looked at Finch. "Why?" Finch closed his eyes. "Because Julian was blackmailing me." The rain seemed to grow louder. Price did not react. "With what?" "I had altered a document." "What document?" "His sister's will." Bell stared. "Mrs. Finch." "Who benefited?" "Julian." "And Mrs. Finch lost." "Yes." "Did she know?" "Eventually." Price nodded. "So Julian controlled you?" "Yes." "And he recorded conversations?" Finch laughed without humor. "Everything." Bell looked at the cassette. "Then why imitate me?" Finch answered slowly. "Because Julian wanted the doctor involved." "Why?" "I don't know." Price's eyes moved to the recorder. "You do." Finch looked at him. Price continued. "You came here last night expecting Hargreaves." "Yes." You heard someone upstairs. Yes. A cough. Yes. Then you left. Yes. Price's voice remained gentle. And later, you returned. Finch went pale. Bell stared at him. You returned? Finch nodded. At 9. Why? The telephone rang. Here? At my office. Who called? Finch looked at the cassette. Julian. Bell's expression hardened. He was dead. I know. Then whose voice? Finch whispered. His. Price said nothing. Finch looked at Bell. I thought somebody was playing the recording. I went back to the house. And? The side door was open. Who opened it? I don't know. What did you see? The telephone. Anything else? No. Did you answer it? No. Then why did you go inside? Finch's hands began to shake. Because Julian said my name. Price watched him. And what did he say? Finch closed his eyes. He said I had forgotten the second copy. Bell looked at Price. The will. Yes. Finch nodded. There was a second document. Where? I thought Julian had it. And did he? No. Who did? Finch looked towards the church door. Mrs. Finch. The explanation had been quietly assembling itself. Not one great secret. Several smaller ones. A false tape. A real recording. A changed will. A hidden key. A woman who had lost a glove. And a dead man whose voice had become useful because so many people had reasons to fear what he might have said while alive. Bell looked at Price. So Mrs. Finch made the calls? Price shook his head. No. Then who? Price placed the cassette back in the box. The person who needed all of you to keep talking. Bell waited. Price looked at Finch. And the person who knew which lies each of you would protect. Finch stared at the floor. You know? I think so. Who? Price did not answer immediately. Instead, he switched off the recorder. The silence that followed seemed unusually complete. Then he said, There is only one person in this village who was expected at Hargreaves's house, arrived without being properly seen, knew about the will, knew about the recordings, and had no reason to tell the truth once Julian was dead. Bell frowned. Mrs. Finch? Price looked at him. No. The church clock began to strike. 1, 2, 3. Bell listened. The rhythm was familiar, slow, measured, exactly like the chimes Mrs. Bell had heard behind the telephone call. Price watched his face. You remember now. Bell looked towards the vestry door. The clock. Yes. Mrs. Bell heard it. Yes. Then the call was made from here. Price shook his head. Not necessarily. Bell stared at him. The sound was recorded. On Hargreaves's machine. Price nodded. And whoever made the calls had access to it. The quiet explanation was finally less frightening than the louder ones. There had been no ghost, no dead man speaking, only a living person arranging voices, memories, and expectations, which, Bell reflected, was considerably worse. Price picked up the wooden box. Come, doctor. Where? To Hargreaves's house. Why? Price opened the vestry door. Because someone has been waiting for us to ask the right question. And what is it? The inspector paused. Not who made the telephone call. Bell followed him into the rain. What then? Price gave him the mildest of smiles. Who needed you to believe it? Price did not answer until they reached Hargreaves's gate. Then he said, The person who needed you to believe it was the person who knew you would be embarrassed to admit you had been fooled. Bell considered this. That sounds like half the village. Possibly. They entered the kitchen. On the table lay a sheet of paper. Bell picked it up. Price stopped him. Don't. He examined it where it lay. There were 3 lines. The first read, Arthur. The second, Finch. The third, Mrs. Bell. Nothing else. Bell felt a tightening in his chest. Why her? Price looked at the paper. Because whoever wrote this wanted us to think she was involved. She isn't. I know. How? Because the note is too obvious. Bell looked at him. That is your reason. My best reason. The inspector walked to the telephone. He lifted the receiver and listened. Nothing. Then he smiled. What? Someone has been clever. Again. I'm afraid so. He pointed to the cord. It had been unplugged. Bell stared. Then how did the calls come through? They didn't. What? The telephone never rang. Bell frowned. I heard it. So did I. Price crouched beside the table. The bell was disconnected. Someone was using a second instrument. Bell understood. The recorder. Yes. Then the calls were staged. Not exactly. Price opened a small cupboard and removed a battery-powered speaker. Bell stared at it. It was hidden here. Yesterday? No. Today? Very likely. The speaker contained a tiny cassette. Price removed it. This explains the voices. Bell nodded. But not the caller. No. Who carried it? Price looked towards the window. Someone who knew where you would stand. Bell followed his gaze. Across the lane, Mrs. Vale was closing her curtains. She saw everything. She saw enough. They crossed the road. Mrs. Vale opened the door before they knocked. I suppose you know. Price smiled. That depends what you know. She looked at Bell. I know the doctor was not the only person who heard him. Who else? Myself. When? On Tuesday. Bell stared. Tuesday? She nodded. Julian came to my house, but he died Wednesday. Yes. What did he want? He asked me to watch his gait. Price's expression remained calm. Why? He said somebody might come pretending to be him. Bell felt the significance immediately. Did he tell you who? No. Did you see that person? Mrs. Vale looked towards the square. Yes. Who? She hesitated. Mr. Finch. Bell said nothing. Price asked, when? Tuesday evening, before Julian died. Yes. What was he doing? He was practicing. Practicing what? Julian's voice. Bell stared at her. Why would Finch imitate him? Mrs. Vale shook her head. He was not doing it for himself. Price looked at her. Who was watching? She looked directly at Bell. Julian. Bell stared. He was alive? Yes. Why would he watch? Because he was teaching him. Price's eyes narrowed. Teaching him to imitate his voice. Mrs. Vale nodded. Julian thought it was funny. Bell almost laughed. Of course. Julian Hargreaves had always possessed a particular talent for making other people's lives difficult for his own amusement. But Price was not smiling. What happened after that? Finch practiced again. Where? At Julian's house. Yesterday, yes. Before you saw him? No. After. Mrs. Vale lowered her voice. He told Finch to make the telephone calls after 9. Bell looked at Price. And why? He wanted Finch to frighten someone. Who? She looked embarrassed. Mrs. Finch. Price understood. The changed will, the missing document, the family quarrel. Hargreaves had been manipulating them all. But Julian was dead by then, Bell said. Yes, Mrs. Vale nodded. That was the part Julian had not planned. Price became very still. What do you mean? Finch did not make the final calls. Who did? Mrs. Vale looked at Bell. Julian's niece. Bell stared. But why? She found the recordings. And used them. Yes. Against Finch. Yes. And against me. Mrs. Vale shook her head. Not against you. Then why call me? Because she wanted you to believe Julian was still alive. Price spoke quietly. For what purpose? Mrs. Vale looked down. She wanted you to change his death certificate. Bell stiffened. No. She thought if you doubted yourself, you would correct it. Price nodded slowly. And once the death certificate changed, Julian's will would become questionable. Bell understood. Mrs. Finch had not needed to kill Julian. She needed his death to look uncertain. That was the quietest trick of all. Bell looked at Price. So Mrs. Finch made the calls. Price shook his head. No. Then who? Price looked at him. The person who needed all of you to keep talking. Bell waited. Price looked at Finch's house. And the person who knew which lies each of you would protect. Bell frowned. Finch? No. Mrs. Finch? No. Then who? Price sighed. Julian. Bell stared. He arranged it before he died. Yes. But why? Because he enjoyed control. Bell thought of the voice. The carefully chosen words, the hidden recorder, the note, the key, it fitted. Julian had not merely expected suspicion. He had designed it. Bell looked at Price. And what did Julian gain from the deception? Price considered the question. Entertainment, perhaps. Control. Certainly, some people collect money. Julian collected obligations. Bell nodded slowly. That sounds like him. Price smiled. It does. Neither man had ever trusted Julian, which was fortunate. Price thanked Mrs. Vale and returned to the road with Bell. Was Mrs. Finch arrested? No. Why not? Because she committed no murder. She falsified evidence. She panicked. That is not an excuse. No. Price looked towards the square. But it explains her. They walked towards the surgery. Behind them, Weatherby settled back into its ordinary rhythm. The baker opened his door. The postmistress sorted letters. The church clock struck noon. No ghost spoke. No dead man telephoned. And somewhere in the village, a woman who had tried to make death uncertain discovered that Inspector Price had never been uncertain at all. He had simply been polite enough to let everybody else become certain first. At the surgery, Mrs. Bell was waiting. She looked at Price. Tea? He nodded. With pleasure. Bell removed his coat. Sugar? 1. Mrs. Bell looked at him. You've become very trusting. Price smiled. Only about tea. She poured. For a few minutes nobody mentioned murder, voices, recordings, wills, or dead men. It was, Bell thought, the most peaceful conversation they had had all week. Then the telephone rang. Everyone stopped. Mrs. Bell looked at Price. Price looked at Bell. Bell walked to the instrument. He lifted the receiver. A voice said, "Doctor?" Bell smiled. "I'm afraid you're too late." The voice sighed. "Why?" "Because we're having tea." There was a pause. Then the caller laughed. It was Mrs. Finch. Price took the receiver. "Good afternoon. I suppose you know." "Yes." "Everything?" "Enough." Another pause. "Then what happens now?" Price looked at Bell. "The village will continue." "That sounds dreadful." "It usually does." He replaced the receiver. Mrs. Bell handed him his tea. Price took it. Bell sat down. Outside, the rain had stopped. The village looked entirely ordinary again, which in Weatherby was usually the final indication that something had been properly settled.